Around 2/3 of men who took part in the study were not all that concerned about the risk of superinfection. They either felt that superinfection would not be that serious, or more interestingly, they felt that acquiring a superinfection was far too unlikely to really worry about. And there was a sense that, that was a pretty remote possibility. So as one man said, yeah, there's kind of a rumor that it's an urban myth. This cross-infection doesn't really happen, so I think somebody once referred to it as scaremongering from the doctors. Essentially, some had begun to question the honesty or integrity of the information they were being provided with by their clinicians. And that's an ideal example of respondents' resistance to the blind acceptance of expert discourses on sexual harms. Authors such as Tulloch and Lupton have said that perceptions of risk are often premised on a blended knowledge, which combines information from within our own experience, as well as what we deem to be trustworthy beyond it. And I think that's partly what we're hearing expressed in the work that we were doing. There's others who called risk, the realization of risk, a work of art. That was a concept put together by Van Loon. And by that, I think he means that we develop our ideas of risk by aligning very diverse areas of life and putting that package together as we see it. And we might be putting together economic, judicial, administrative, emotional issues together in the way that we are perceiving our imaginary of risk. Certainly there was a sense among the men that we interviewed that they hadn't experienced or known or heard of anybody who had superinfection. So it must be a means of control by which the clinicians are saying, yeah, but you still have to be good. You still have to be good because you could get this superinfection thing. When actually they had no lived experience around them of it's not something I've heard of. So in terms of the physical risks, I've dashed through some of those. There is also concern about moral and social harm that is extensive for the men taking part in this study. So I just want to move on to talking about some of the non-physical harms that they considered. Some men expressed a real need to do the right thing and to see themselves as good people. And that was a real motivator for them. They acknowledged the fact that they engaged in UAI, but they stressed that they only did so in specific circumstances. And for such men, this was really essential for maintaining a sense of moral integrity. It only happens sometimes. It only happens under these particular circumstances. Most commonly, this involved disclosing their HIV status to sexual partners. And by telling their sexual partner that they were HIV positive, they could reduce the possibility of feeling guilty about subsequently engaging in unprotected sex. So there was a concern that, feeling guilty can be a real harm for me, and I need to find a way of managing that preemptively to make sure that isn't a situation I fall into. So a quote from one man was, I have always been upfront about it with people. Always, always, always. Because I always thought at least I could hold my head up and say, well, at least I was honest. And the guys who were quick to say that they only engage in unprotected sex in specific circumstances were also very quick to distance themselves from other diagnosed men who they perceived engaged in bareback sex willy-nilly. Being seen as a frequent engager in UAI was also a harm because being seen to be that person undertaking that activity was a real threat to their desired identity as a good person. I need to see myself as a good person, so I really need to get some distance between me and all those positive guys who are doing God knows what. And there's a real distancing there that we were finding. Many men were keen to say they weren't that type of positive men. There's a real sense that there is a type and that there's all kinds of filthy stuff going on, and I really cannot be seen to be a part of that. So there was a sense that they needed to reproduce, particularly in the interview context, and I recognize, the issues about that, about self-representation in the interview, that what they were doing was responsible and that there was something else going on amongst another group of people. However, disclosure was also not without its own potential harms. Nearly every single one of the men in the study, regardless of age, regardless of their time since diagnosis, and we were interviewing men who were diagnosed for 22, 23 years in some cases, regardless of where they lived, every single man talked about being worried about being rejected by sexual partners if they disclosed their HIV status. Rejection could cause harm in an individual's self-esteem and self-confidence, and that was a prevailing issue that came up, and that was often very long-lasting. Men talked about, taking 10 years to recover from some of the instances of rejection they'd received. Some men were very clearly in the midst of still reeling from some of the experiences that they had. And so that had major impact on their capacity to disclose in the future. And as one man said, I'd say to someone that I'm HIV positive, and there would be a really strange reaction to it, and I'd have to leave that person's house, kind of thing, and you feel like a bit of a pariah, or people would, get this horrible reaction to it. So having trying to respond to one potential harm. I'm trying to manage my identity. I'm trying to be a good person. I'm trying to disclose. So I'm trying to manage harm through disclosing. And yet that can all of a sudden trigger an altogether different kind of harm, which is rejection and what I sense is a real attack on my self-esteem and who I am. It also means a loss of sexual opportunity. And we can't be unrealistic about that. So there were men who talked about disclosures that went well, but the overriding narrative is the fact that when I disclose in a space that isn't a positive space, it's really, really difficult to make that go well. So now I'm going to kind of swing to, I've sort of identified the physical and non-physical harms. I want to sort of focus on managing and tools of managing harm. The first potential harm, being the most obvious, is transmitting HIV to another person. And none of the men were comfortable with potentially being the source of onward infection. And in response, many did choose to use condoms. It's not as though the men in this group who had had at least one instance of unprotected sex in the last year were never using condoms. Almost all of them used condoms at least some of the time. There were only a handful who really, really didn't use condoms at all. And they were describing, the incapacity to maintain an erection, basically, and that they'd given up condoms a long time ago. For some men, aiming to use condoms was seen as the only option, and they couldn't conceive of having sex without one, and to do so would be irresponsible. However, at some point in the last year, they'd obviously not held up to their own standards, because otherwise they wouldn't be taking part in the study. For some, maintaining that real golden rule indefinitely of always using condoms was unlikely, and they perceived it that way. They expressed it that way. Their actions, they said, were influenced by alcohol or by other people, perhaps other partners who were pressuring them not to use condoms. And what was significant, though, which was interesting for us, was that very few of these men had a fallback plan. So there's this golden rule among a subgroup of men who are saying, I'm always going to use condoms, I'm always going to use condoms, I'm absolutely always going to use condoms. And yet, when in a situation where that's challenged or it doesn't happen, there's no backup. There's no other tactics. So it's all or nothing. And so, there's no sense of, okay, well, if I can't do that, I can do serosorting instead, or I can make sure that I don't come inside them, or I can make sure that I'm the receptive partner, and, all those kind of didn't play. And so we were kind of struck by the real all or nothing approach that the men in this study had to how they managed risk. And so basically, we were finding that our health promotion colleagues who we work with are talking about this whole beautiful array of risk reduction tactics that men can choose from, like a sweetie box, and it's all, it all makes a lot of sense in a very, clear light of day way. But the men in this study, by and large, didn't want to acknowledge that they were knowingly taking risks. And to actually pick and choose from that box those tactics strategies, and today I'm going to do I'll do a little bit of serosorting and a little bit of withdrawal, made them feel like that would be really calculating. And then I would have to acknowledge myself as a risk taker. So in order to make those selections and do quite a lot of calculation and management of risk, it would mean I'd have to acknowledge risk. And actually what I want to do most in my life primarily is not acknowledge the risk that I might pose to others, because that's just a little bit too much. So they didn't want to be seen to be a man who actively managed risk. And I think that presents us in health promotion with quite a dilemma. So that's one of the things that I think would be very interesting for us to talk about afterwards. We've heard about how disclosing status is seen as a way for men to ensure that they do the right thing and uphold their moral integrity, sometimes even when condoms were being used. So what we did is when we were interviewing men, they would talk about disclosing their status and then essentially putting the ball in the other person's court as to what would happen next. Okay, I've told you, now it's up to you. So that might mean it was the partner's choice whether to have any sex at all, to use condoms, to only have oral sex. In a way, it was seen as a means of transferring or sharing responsibility for the sex that was about to happen. And one man said, "I've had people say to me, surely you should insist on them wearing a condom." And I've said, hang on a minute, it's just as much their responsibility as mine. I've told them the score and I've said, look, you should wear a condom. If they choose not to, it's not my fault. Some men took disclosure and the whole notion of attending to serostatus further and did try to sort out the partners that they engaged in anal intercourse with according to their serostatus. Having unprotected anal intercourse only with men who were also positive eliminated the chance of passing on HIV. And men would say, right, well, if I'm positive, you're positive, okay, we can have bareback sex. No further negotiation is needed and it's all done. But serosorting only works as a risk reduction tactic when it's done flawlessly. And that you can absolutely be confident that your sexual partner is also diagnosed positive. And we'll see in a moment that it's not always flawless. So men disclose either out of a desire to do the right thing and be honest and responsible people to avoid harm to their moral sense of self, or they see it as a starting point to other risk reduction activities, such as serosorting. However, we can see that disclosure can lead to an altogether different kind of harm, and it allows for the possibility of rejection, which can cause significant damage to an individual's self-esteem. So what we observed in the men that we interviewed was disclosure, sort of very much in inverted commas. And so as one example of this, there was a quote from one man who said, okay, this is kind of his instance of how he puts enough information out there that he would consider that somebody should be picking up what he means. There's a 19-year-old not too far away who keeps texting me for sex. And what I've basically done with him is I've said, look, I have a lot of bareback sex. I have bareback sex with HIV positive men. You are at risk if you have sex with me, without saying I'm HIV positive. Right? So he puts together a package of information without putting himself in the position of saying, I'm positive, and he needs that information to be understood in a particular way so that he can not give up too much of himself, but try to make it clear that there is a considerable amount of risk if you have unprotected sex with me. There are colleagues in the UK who kind of talked about sero-guessing as opposed to sero-sorting as a notion of, this is a very woolly, grey system of communication that people might be engaged in. And as I was saying, sero-sorting, which is choosing to only have sex with other HIV-positive men, was used by some as a means of avoiding HIV transmission to another person. So for some, serosorting did carry a lot of uncomfortable negative connotations at the same time as it providing some opportunity for freedom and lack of rejection. There were men who said selecting partners based on their HIV status really kind of trashed the whole romantic ideal. You mean I just have to pick from them? Because if I'm just picking from them and I have a really negative association with what it is to be an HIV positive guy, then I feel like I have to pick from a pool of people that I really don't want to associate with very much. And so there was a real sense among the men in our interview that they wanted to disassociate themselves from the type of positive men who would be looking for other positive men. And so for them it was regarded as a risk calculation that might mix you in with some pretty seedy company, and that wasn't something that they were willing to do. We have a website in the UK and across Europe called Gaydar, and there's a lot more sex and dating websites for gay men in North America, but I think Gaydar is in pretty common use over here as well, or not so much? A little bit? Yeah, okay. So as one man said, if you ever went into Gaydar and you put HIV positive as a search, you tend to come up with a certain type of gay man who is giving the impression of being very promiscuous and into just about, everything. On the other hand, having sex with other men who were also diagnosed with HIV allowed some respondents the opportunity to fulfill their sexual needs. They felt that they could have uninhibited sex free from concern about onward transmission of HIV. For those guys, that was really essential, but they were a very, very small proportion of the people that we interviewed.